June 12, 1943 p.m.'ünde. Baltic Coast, Germany. The night was cold, heavy with sea mist rolling in from the Baltic. A faint orange glow pulsed behind the dunes, where an isolated compound of concrete bunkers and radar towers crouched under blackout curtains. Inside the largest hangar, a weapon no soldier had ever seen before was being armed for its first real test. The engineers called it Vergeltungswaffe 1, the weapon of retribution 1. To the rest of the world, it would become known by another name, the V-1 flying bomb. The launch crew moved in near silence, boots scraping on the steel scaffolding as they bolted the bomb's stubby wings into place. The weapon looked crude, like a steel torpedo, welded to a pair of wings, a pulse jet engine slung across its back. But to the men in Peenemünde, this wasn't a bomb. It was an idea. At the center of the scene stood Major General Walter Dornberger, commander of the German Army's secret rocket program. His heavy coat was soaked with mist, but his voice was steady. "We are not launching a missile," he told his men. "We are launching the future." Beside him, the young engineer Werner von Braun watched the fueling process with unblinking eyes. Kerosene fumes hung thick in the air, stinging his nose. Every gauge, every line of pressure, every sound mattered. He knew one error could turn this miracle weapon into an inferno. Beyond the barbed wire perimeter, the Baltic roared like distant artillery. Then, a low metallic whir filled the air, a hiss, and a sudden, deafening roar. The pulse jet engine came alive, coughing blue fire across the launch ramp. The vibration shook the sand, rattling the teeth of every man watching. The bomb crept forward, its stubby wings catching the night air then. With a blinding burst of flame, it leapt from the ramp and screamed across the horizon. For 7 seconds, the men stood frozen. Then the glow vanished. They listened. 5 seconds. 10. Then boom. A dull, rolling thunder somewhere miles away. Dornberger exhaled slowly. "Gentlemen," he said, "it flies." Von Braun turned to his team, his expression unreadable. The weapon had flown, but where had it landed? In Berlin, the dreamers of the Nazi High Command already imagined the headlines. London, in flames. The British Empire paralyzed by fear. But among the scientists, there was another feeling, something darker. Because they all knew the weapon wasn't accurate. It wasn't stable. And, in that moment, many realized what they were building wasn't just a technological marvel. It was a machine for killing civilians. Days later, reports from the test range confirmed it. The bomb had flown 150 miles before impact. Crude, erratic, but real. The Reich Ministry of Armaments sent congratulations. Speer himself visited Peenemünde, praising their genius. "Germany now possesses the power to strike its enemies without risking a single pilot," he said, smiling thinly. "This is justice." But for every word of praise, there was also fear. The Allies had begun aerial reconnaissance of northern Germany. British photo interpreters had noticed strange launch rails along the Baltic. Somewhere, across the channel, a quiet alarm had already been sounded. In London, at MI-14 and the Air Ministry's Scientific Intelligence Branch, the first photos arrived in a sealed envelope marked "Most Secret." Inside, blurry aerial images of Peenemünde, long tracks, concrete ramps, and strange torpedo-shaped objects under camouflage netting. One analyst whispered, "Looks like an aircraft, but too small to carry a man." Another frowned. "Then what carries it?" In Peenemünde, the tests continued. The engineers worked 16-hour days, often sleeping under their drafting tables. The roar of the pulse jet became the heartbeat of the base. They improved the gyroscope, adjusted the fuel mixture, modified the airframe. They knew that, once perfected, the V-1 could be launched not just from Germany but from France, directly across the channel. To the British, that distance was everything. To the Germans, it meant revenge. That same summer, von Braun wrote in his journal, "We are advancing beyond artillery, beyond aircraft. The machine no longer needs the man. But without the man, what is the purpose?" It was a question few dared to ask out loud, because in the offices of the Reich, Men like Heinrich Himmler and Albert Speer weren't thinking about ethics. They were thinking about production. Thousands of these flying bombs, hidden in concrete bunkers along the French coast. Thousands of them fired at London every week, every day. The numbers were chilling. The ambition, unstoppable. As dawn broke over Peenemünde, the first V1 sat ready for mass testing. Its warhead contained nearly 1,800 pounds of high explosive. Its range, 150 miles. Its speed, 400 miles per hour. No human aboard. No mercy intended. The world had never seen a weapon like this, a machine that didn't fight for control of the sky, but simply ignored it. Back in London, radar operators began noticing strange blips over the channel. Too fast for a bomber, too slow for a jet. They didn't know it yet, but they were watching the birth of a new kind of warfare, one that would change the balance of terror forever. Question lingered in the minds of British intelligence. What if this wasn't a plane at all? What if it was something entirely new? August 1943, London, England. A grey dawn leaked through the blackout curtains of Whitehall. Inside room 47 of the Air Ministry, cigarette smoke hung in thick ribbons above a long oak table. Around it sat a collection of weary men and women, engineers, intelligence officers, photo analysts. Their task was clear, yet impossible. Determine what Germany was building at Peenemünde and why. At the head of the table stood Dr. R.V. Jones, Scientific Intelligence Officer for the Royal Air Force. His tie was crooked, his hair unkempt, not out of rebellion, but exhaustion. For months, he'd been piecing together intercepted messages, aerial photos, and fragments of rumors that pointed to something far beyond conventional warfare. He placed a grainy photograph on the table. "Gentlemen," he began quietly, "these rails aren't for aircraft, they're for missiles." A murmur filled the room. One officer snorted. "Missiles? You mean rockets, Jones? That's science fiction." Jones didn't flinch. "Science fiction," he said evenly, "is becoming strategy." The skepticism was understandable. Britain had already endured years of the Blitz, thousands of bombs dropped from Heinkel and Dornier aircraft. But those were weapons the RAF understood. Bombers had pilots, engines, flight paths. You could hear them coming, intercept them, shoot them down. This new threat? It was invisible, unfathomable, and to many in the intelligence community, it sounded like paranoia. But Jones had seen too much to dismiss it. In one intercepted German message, the codename FZG-76 appeared repeatedly, a term associated with an experimental flying device. Other decrypts from the Abwehr mentioned Vergeltungswaffe, or V-weapons. The phrase translated literally to weapons of retribution. Retribution for what? Jones already knew the answer. The Allied bombing of Hamburg had just killed over 40,000 people. The Nazis wanted revenge, and they wanted it automated. Peenemünde, Germany. Far across the channel, that revenge was being forged. Inside a reinforced hangar, Oberst Max Wachtel of the Luftwaffe stood before his test team, clipboard in hand. "Every weapon has a soul," he told them. "This one has none." The engineers laughed softly, but Wachtel didn't smile. He'd seen the first V1 test crash into a nearby forest, detonating so violently that the shockwave shattered windows 5 miles away. The machine didn't care who it killed, or if it returned home. That cold efficiency fascinated the Reich's leadership. Within weeks, Hitler himself had ordered the V1 program expanded. Peenemunde's days of secrecy were numbered. The 17th of August, 1943, Operation Hydra. Shortly before midnight, the sky over the Baltic ignited. Hundreds of RAF Lancaster bombers from the 5th Bomber Group thundered in over the German coast. Their target, Peenemünde. The decision had been made after Jones's warnings reached Churchill himself. "Burn the site to the ground," the Prime Minister ordered. No miracle weapons for Hitler. The bombing lasted less than an hour, but its aftermath was hell. Engines screamed. Searchlights carved the night. Bombs tore through sand and steel. Dozens of scientists and hundreds of forced laborers were killed. Von Braun barely escaped alive. When the smoke cleared, The Germans relocated their production to underground tunnels near Nordhausen, the Mittelwerk complex, using concentration camp prisoners from Mittelbau-Dora. The weapon would live on, but now it would be built in darkness. In London, Jones received word of the raid's success. He felt only partial relief. He knew what would come next. Retaliation. Sure enough, within weeks, reconnaissance planes began spotting long concrete structures being built across northern France near Pas-de-Calais, Cherbourg, and the Somme. Massive, fortified ramp pointing west. Launch sites, Jones whispered, tracing the arc on the map that ended in the heart of London. His superiors were hesitant. "You're certain these aren't coastal defenses?" one asked. Jones slammed his fist on the table. "They're not protecting France," he said. "They're preparing to attack England." Winter 1943, northern France. German engineers worked under freezing rain, assembling launch ramps hidden among dunes and hedgerows. Trucks brought crates marked Flakspiegel Fragile. Inside, pulse, jet engines, each capable of propelling a bomb at 400 miles per hour. Civilian villages were cleared overnight. Farmers were ordered off their land. Local resistance groups began sending coded messages to London describing strange aircraft with no pilots. One farmer near Dieppe wrote simply, "They hum like bees, then vanish." In London, MI6 analysts cross-referenced the reports. Every new launch ramp pointed toward one target, the British capital. But still, the inner circles of command hesitated. Churchill's generals were wary of overcommitting resources to phantom weapons. The V1, after all, had yet to strike a single British city. Some thought it propaganda, a bluff to divert Allied attention from the upcoming invasion of France. It was a dangerous assumption, because in Germany, the countdown had already begun. Back in Peenemünde, von Braun and Dornberger reviewed the latest flight data. The guidance system had improved. The engine was stable. The range extended to 250 kilometers. "Soon," Dornberger said quietly, "London will feel what Hamburg felt." Von Braun looked at the data, then at the sky outside. He was a scientist, a dreamer. But even he could no longer escape what his creation had become. By the spring of 1944, over 100 launch sites were active across northern France. The British still didn't know the weapon's name. They didn't know when or how it would strike. They only knew that something was coming. Something they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't stop. The Battle of Mines had begun, and the first victims would soon be chosen not by soldiers, but by mathematics. Le 13 juin 1944, Kent, England. The morning sky was calm. The war felt distant. Farmers in the fields of Kent worked under a pale summer sun, the sound of church bells drifting lazily across the hedgerows. Then came a sound no one had ever heard before, a mechanical buzz, rhythmic and flat, like an angry swarm of bees. At first, a few looked up, expecting to see a damaged aircraft limping toward the channel. But the object was smaller, faster, flying low, with a flicker of flame behind it. A woman named Edith Summers, standing outside her cottage, later recalled, "It was like a small plane with its engine coughing." Then suddenly the noise stopped, and the world went quiet. Seconds later, the bomb hit. A single V1 slammed into Grove Road, Bethnal Green. 20 people died instantly. The robot bomb had arrived. In London, sirens wailed again, the same sound that had haunted the city during the Blitz. But this time, the danger was different. There were no pilots to kill, no formations to track on radar. The Von Second came alone, fast and low, their engines droning until the final silence before detonation. By noon that day, 9 more had struck southern England. When Winston Churchill was informed, he didn't speak for several seconds. Then, quietly, "So it's true then. The pilotless plane." He turned to his military secretary. "Tell Fighter Command, we are at war with a machine." At the Air Ministry, panic gave way to determination. The British had underestimated the threat, now they had to counter it in real time. R.V. Jones, the same man who had warned them months earlier, was called back into the War Cabinet room. His eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion. The Prime Minister asked him one question. Can we stop them? Jones hesitated. Yes, he said, but only if we fight the air itself. Fighter Command scrambled immediately. Squadrons of Hawker Tempests, Spitfire Monk 14s, and Mosquitoes were deployed to intercept the incoming bombs. But the Von 2nd were fast, nearly 400 miles per hour, faster than any bomber, slower than a jet. Pilots had to chase them at treetop level, risking collision or explosion. One pilot, Flying Officer Ken Collier, described the first intercept. You didn't shoot it down, you danced with it. You came alongside, matched its speed, then nudged its wingtip. If you touched it just right, the gyroscope failed, and it tumbled out of the sky. It was absurd, and it worked. Pilots called it tipping. For every V-1 they destroyed, another 3 slipped through. In the skies over the English Channel, radar operators strained to keep up. Chain home stations began detecting the low, fast signatures of the bombs, their curved flight paths confusing the instruments. At RAF Biggin Hill, controllers watched blips appear, vanish, and reappear again. 5 incoming, altitude 600 feet. Vector Tempest Squadron East. Contact lost another over Dover. Each blip could mean 50 lives. The strain was unbearable. On the ground, Londoners learned to listen for silence. The drone meant safety, the bomb was still in the air. When the engine cut out, everyone froze. They had 10 seconds, maybe less. Children dived under tables. Bus drivers slammed brakes. People prayed in doorways. The V-1 didn't choose its victims, it merely ran out of fuel. By the end of the first week, more than 2,500 bombs had been launched. The British called them buzz bombs. The Germans called them justice. But behind the German triumph was a growing realization. The weapon's terror was indiscriminate. It rarely hit its intended targets. Entire bombs would drift miles off course, crashing into open countryside or even occupied towns in Belgium. Von Braun, now reassigned to the V-2 rocket program, watched from afar as his earlier creation turned cities into ash. He wrote bitterly to Dornberger, "They call it vengeance. I call it mathematics without conscience." Meanwhile, British intelligence worked feverishly. MI-14's analysts, aided by aerial reconnaissance, began mapping every suspected launch site in France. Using data from the French resistance, they located the massive bunkers at Wizernes and Siracourt, capable of launching dozens of Von 2nd per day. Operation Crossbow was ordered an all-out bombing campaign to obliterate the sites before they could reload. For weeks, Allied bombers pounded northern France, dropping thousands of tons of bombs. Yet even as the craters widened, new ramps appeared like scars in the soil. Every time one was destroyed, another rose somewhere else. In July, Churchill issued a grim directive. If this is their vengeance, ours will be precision. The British began feeding false intelligence to the Germans through double agents, reports claiming the bombs were overshooting London. The ruse worked. German engineers adjusted the launch coordinates northward, and the bombs began falling short, landing harmlessly in open fields. It was a small, brilliant victory, a battle fought not with guns, but with information. By August 1944, as Allied troops advanced through Normandy, the V-1 threat began to fade. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect its launch sites, and the advancing Allies overran many of them. But the reprieve was brief, because in hidden tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains, a new weapon was being prepared faster, deadlier, impossible to intercept. Its Name was Vergeltungswaffe 2. The V-2. As Churchill toured the wreckage of a V-1 that had failed to explode, he picked up a twisted piece of metal, still warm. He stared at it for a long moment. "They've given us a glimpse of the next war," he murmured, "and God help the one after that." September 1944, Antwerp, Belgium. The air raid sirens had been quiet for weeks. The Allies believed they had finally outrun the Von 2nd by capturing the French coast. Children played in the rubble-strewn streets. British convoys rumbled through the port, and dockworkers hoisted crates stamped U.S. Army ordnance into warehouses. The war, they thought, was moving east. Then came a single explosion, deep, concussive, and unlike any sound before. The ground rippled. Windows shattered across the entire harbor. No sirens had sounded. No aircraft had approached. There had been no warning. When the smoke cleared, a crater 20 feet deep and 60 feet wide smoldered where the warehouse once stood. No bomb fragment could be found. No engine, no fuselage, just fine dust and twisted steel. Forensic officers from the Royal Engineers examined the scene. One of them whispered, "It came from above, but faster than anything I've ever seen." They were right. The V-2 had arrived. In a command tent near Brussels, Field Marshal Montgomery studied the crater reports. He slammed his hand on the table. New plane, new sound, new intercept. How do you fight a ghost? The new German weapon wasn't a rumor anymore. It was the world's first ballistic missile, a rocket that soared 60 miles into the stratosphere before falling faster than the speed of sound. It was unstoppable. And for the first time since 1940, the Allies were defenseless. Back in Germany Mittelwerk, Harz Mountains, thousands of forced laborers toiled under the earth. The tunnels were vast kilometers of damp, choking corridors carved into the rock. Men worked until they collapsed. The smell of oil, metal filings, and decay filled the air. Over them, under floodlights, engineers in crisp uniforms assembled the new weapon, Vergeltungswaffe II. Each was 46 feet tall, its skin painted olive gray, bearing the eagle insignia of the Wehrmacht. Von Braun stood in silence, his face lit by the gleam of the rocket's casing. The perfection of it both awed and haunted him. He had wanted to reach the stars. Instead, his creation was aimed at London. Dornberger's voice broke the silence. "You've given the Führer a divine weapon, Werner. Now he will use it as such." Von Braun didn't answer. The roar of machinery drowned his thoughts. Every launch meant hundreds of dead, both in London and in the tunnels of Mittelwerk. The 8th of September 1944, Wassenaar, the Netherlands. Under camouflage nets and guarded by SS troops, the first operational V-2 was prepared for launch. The crew checked the gyroscopes, filled the tanks with alcohol fuel and liquid oxygen, and stepped back as the countdown began. At precisely 10:41 a.m., the rocket ignited. A pillar of fire erupted beneath it, shaking the forest. The missile rose vertically, then arced westward toward London. 5 minutes later, Chiswick, a quiet London suburb, vanished in an instant. 3 houses obliterated. 11 civilians killed, dozens wounded, and again no warning. Only the sound of an explosion that came after the impact. Newsreel cameras rolled through the wreckage, but the government censored the footage. Publicly, they called it a gas main explosion. Privately, Churchill was furious. "We must not admit the enemy can strike at will," he ordered. "Panic is their ally." Behind the scenes, R.V. Jones and British intelligence raced to locate the launch points. Aerial photography was useless. The rockets were mobile, fired from forest clearings and truck-mounted platforms that vanished hours later. Mi-14 analysts resorted to geometry, triangulating trajectories based on impact angles and blast patterns. It was painstaking, dangerous, and sometimes absurd, but slowly, they mapped the invisible battle. The RAF retaliated with Operation Big Ben, low-level attacks on suspected launch areas in Holland. Mosquito and Typhoon squadrons roared across the North Sea, strafing convoys and shelling forests. But for every launch site destroyed, another appeared. By late October, over 100 V-2 seconds had struck London, Antwerp, and Liège. The fear was relentless. There were no air raid warnings now. No sirens. Only sudden annihilation. In an underground war cabinet bunker, Churchill listened to the latest casualty reports. He turned to Jones again. "You were right once, Jones. Can you be right again? Can we stop this?" Jones's reply was almost a whisper. "Not in the sky, Prime Minister. Only at the source." And so began one of the most daring aerial campaigns of the war, an attempt to destroy the V-2 production lines buried inside the Harz Mountains. Thousands of Allied bombers flew at night through flak and cloud, dropping Tallboy and Grand Slam bombs, hoping the shockwaves would collapse the tunnels. Some hits succeeded, most didn't. The mountains swallowed the explosions and kept breathing. December 1944 Antwerp again. The V-2 seconds rained down daily. One struck the Rex Cinema during a Saturday matinee, killing 567 civilians, more than any single German air raid since the Blitz. A Belgian rescue worker wrote in his diary that night, "There was no warning, no sound, just fire from heaven. The Allies could only endure and advance." As the front pushed deeper into Germany, the launch areas slowly fell silent. But each rocket left an aftertaste, a promise that warfare had changed forever. In early 1945, British engineers examined fragments of an intact V-2 that failed to detonate. They spread the pieces across a hangar floor, tracing each section with chalk. The engine, the fuel tanks, the guidance fins, all revolutionary. Jones stood among them, hands in pockets, whispering, "We fought men, now we fight their machines." He wasn't wrong. The war had entered an era where genius and destruction were indistinguishable. And the men who built these weapons would soon have to face a different kind of reckoning, one history wasn't prepared to judge. May 1945 Peenemünde. Germany. The once secret rocket base lay silent. Burned-out hangars, shattered rail lines, papers fluttering in the Baltic wind. Everything that had once embodied German scientific ambition was now ash and echoes. The war was over. The flags that flew above the bunkers had changed. A convoy of U.S. Army trucks rolled through the gates that spring morning, the stars on their hoods stark against the gray sky. They were part of Operation Paperclip, a quiet mission to find, collect, and relocate the greatest minds of the German war machine before the Soviets could claim them. Among the prisoners waiting near the docks stood a tall, gaunt man in a torn officer's coat. His hands were raw from cold, but his posture remained upright, defiant, exhausted. Dr. Wernher von Braun. He held a folder of blueprints under one arm, sketches of rockets far larger than the V-2, capable, he said, of reaching the stars. To the soldiers who escorted him, he spoke in a calm, practiced English. "My work was never meant for war, only for flight." The sergeant who cuffed him muttered, "Tell that to London." In London, there were no celebrations for the fall of the rocket program, only statistics. Over 9,000 civilians killed by V-1 and V-2 strikes. Another 20,000 prisoners dead in the tunnels of Middlework, buried beneath the same machines they built. R.V. Jones, now older, stood before Parliament's Science Committee that autumn. His report was concise, factual, and without triumph. The enemy weapon advanced faster than our imagination. The only advantage we held was the courage to admit what we did not understand. Behind his words was a truth too bitter for applause, that the same science which built cathedrals and bridges could also manufacture silence, fear, and shadows. Nordhausen, Germany, the Middlework tunnels. The liberation forces descended into the earth to find what the Reich had hidden. Rows of half-finished rockets leaned against the stone walls like cold monoliths. Beneath them, the corpses of slave laborers lay where they fell starved, beaten, forgotten. The air was heavy with the smell of fuel and decay. One American officer, Colonel Edward Hall, later said, "It wasn't a factory, it was a grave that built machines." He ordered every camera to keep rolling to capture evidence of what science looked like without mercy. Yet within months, the same rockets were being loaded onto Allied trains. V-2 components were shipped to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, others to Moscow's Kapustin Yar. Both sides, former enemies, now raced to unlock the weapon's potential for the future. The Cold War began not with diplomacy, but with stolen blueprints and borrowed scientists. Von Braun, now wearing a U.S. Army uniform patch, stood in the desert of the American Southwest, watching one of his captured V-2 seconds rise into a clear blue sky. The same weapon that once screamed toward London now climbed toward space. He smiled faintly, whispering to a colleague, "This is what it was meant for." But even he could never quite erase the ghosts that followed it. London, 1952. Rain tapped against the window panes of a small cafe near Bethnal Green. An older woman stirred her tea slowly. Her name was Edith Summers, the same woman who had once watched a strange buzzing shape cross the sky 9 years earlier. Outside, children laughed on the sidewalk, chasing the sound of airplanes' overhead jets, sleek and harmless in peacetime. Edith flinched at the sound, then forced herself to smile. To her, the war wasn't about nations or weapons. It was about that one sound, the droning pulse that stopped, the silence that followed, the seconds before the world changed. For millions like her, the V-weapons weren't a chapter in history books. They were a scar on the sky. In 1969, the world watched as a rocket Saturn V lifted astronauts toward the moon. The television announcer proudly said the name of the man behind it, Wernher von Braun. Children cheered. The world celebrated a triumph of human ingenuity. But in London, a few who remembered the summer of 1944 turned off their sets in silence, because they understood the irony. The road to the moon had begun with the road to London. The same equations, the same engines, the same man. R.V. Jones died in 1997. In his final interview, he said quietly, "Science is a mirror. It reflects whatever face looks into it. During the war, we saw our own reflection brilliant, ruthless, and afraid. The ruins of Peenemünde still stand today. The bunkers are cracked, overgrown with grass. Birds nest inside the launch ramps. Visitors walk through the remains of laboratories where men once imagined the future and built it out of fire. The wind off the Baltic carries no sound of engines now, only the rustle of leaves and the whisper of the sea. And somewhere in that silence lies the unspoken truth of the V1 and V2 that human genius can reach the heavens, but it first learned to fall."